Sleep clings to you like wet clothes you never get to take off. The alarm rings, and even after 8 hours in bed, your body feels like it carried furniture up 3 flights of stairs all night. You stare at the ceiling fan, the one you forgot to turn off again, and you wonder why a house full of switches, sensors, and screens leaves you more drained than the houses your grandparents lived in ever did. You wake up with a headache that has no clear cause, a dry throat that water does not seem to fix, and a strange heaviness behind your eyes that follows you through the entire morning. None of this feels dramatic enough to mention to a doctor, so you just accept it as the price of modern life, the price of living indoors, sealed, comfortable, and supposedly safe. There is a reason this feeling exists, and it traces back to a single room, a single decision made decades before anyone had ever flipped a light switch in their own home. And once you understand where that decision came from, you will never look at your own bedroom the same way again. On the morning of February the 11th, in the year 1847, in the small town of Milan, Ohio, a child was born into a farmhouse with no electricity, no running water, and no artificial light beyond candles and oil lamps that his mother rationed carefully because both were expensive and considered slightly dangerous for a young child to be near for long periods. That child was Thomas Alva Edison, and although history remembers him for the glowing filament he would perfect decades later, what almost nobody discusses is the room he slept in as a boy. A room built according to rules that had shaped human shelter for thousands of years. Rules that had nothing to do with comfort in the way we understand it today, but everything to do with survival, breath, and the slow, patient relationship between a house and the air moving through it. Edison grew up to light entire cities, but on those early nights in Ohio, he was simply a child lying in the dark, inside a structure that, without anyone realizing it, was a perfect machine for keeping a human body alive and rested, using nothing but wood, plaster, glass, and the wind. Before electricity reached ordinary homes, the average house in Europe or North America was built around 3 unbreakable rules that almost nobody thinks about anymore. Yet every single one of them shaped how comfortable or uncomfortable a person felt while sleeping. The first rule was that every room needed direct access to natural light because oil lamps and candles were too dim, too costly, and too risky to rely on for hours at a time. As a result, houses tended to be narrow, often no more than 7 or 8 meters deep, with windows placed on at least 2 walls of almost every room, so that daylight could reach into every corner during working hours. The second rule was that heat naturally rose, so bedrooms were almost always placed on upper floors, where warm air gathered after climbing from kitchens, fireplaces, and communal rooms below, while the ground floor stayed closer to the source of heat. The third rule, and the one most directly connected to how exhausted you feel right now, was that ventilation had to be constant and entirely passive, because there was no machine capable of pushing air through a sealed box. Walls were expected to breathe. Wood expanded and contracted with the seasons. Windows were tall and were rarely sealed with the kind of tight rubber-gasketed frames we use today, partly because perfect sealing would have trapped the smoke from oil lamps, candles, and fireplaces inside the room, which could quickly become deadly in an enclosed space. A typical bedroom from 1847 had thick plaster walls, often 18 to 24 centimeters wide, made from a mixture of lime, sand, and horsehair, a combination that absorbed moisture from the air during humid hours of the day and slowly released it back into the room overnight, functioning almost like a giant, silent, completely free humidifying and dehumidifying system built directly into the bones of the house. Floorboards were usually unsealed pine or oak, laid with small gaps that allowed air to move slightly between the room above and the space below. Windows were tall, frequently stretching from waist height nearly to the ceiling, fitted with simple wooden sashes that warped slightly with the seasons, creating tiny but constant gaps that allowed a slow, continuous exchange of air, even when the window itself was technically closed. Diaries and household manuals from the period full of complaints about cold floors in winter, about drafts near windows, about the smell of damp wood after a storm. Yet medical journals from the 1840s and 50s almost never mention people waking up with the specific kind of grogginess, headache and mental fog that we now associate with poor indoor air quality, because that particular kind of exhaustion was structurally close to impossible inside a house that had never learned how to seal itself shut. The boy from that Ohio farmhouse grew into the same Thomas Edison who, by 1879, at the age of 32, had set up his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, just a short train ride from where he had once slept in pure, unlit darkness as a child. His ambition at that moment was almost laughably narrow compared to everything that eventually followed from it. He was not attempting to redesign the human bedroom, the modern city, or the air people breathe while they sleep. He was trying to solve one specific mechanical problem, which was finding a filament capable of glowing steadily for more than a few minutes without burning out or shattering the glass bulb around it. According to laboratory notebooks preserved at the Thomas Edison National Historical Park, his team tested more than 6,000 different materials over more than a year of relentless trial and error, including platinum wires, cotton thread coated in carbon, and even strands of hair taken from the beards of his own laboratory assistants. Most attempts lasted only seconds before burning out in a small smoking flash. The breakthrough finally came with carbonized bamboo, sourced from a fan in his office, which allowed a single bulb to burn continuously for over 1,200 hours, a number that seemed almost unbelievable at the time. With that single, narrow success, the age of electric light quietly began, not as a sweeping revolution announced with fanfare, but as a small, stubborn improvement to one glowing filament inside one glass bulb in one laboratory. The first wave of impact from that bulb stayed remarkably small and local, confined almost entirely to industry rather than the home. Electric light spread first through factories and textile mills, particularly across Manchester in England and the mill towns scattered through Massachusetts, where owners quickly realized that gaslighting created soot that damaged delicate fabric and created constant fire risks that insurance companies despised. Between 1882 and 1890, electric lighting installed in American textile factories reduced insurance premiums by close to 40% in several documented districts, simply because electric bulbs produced no open flame and far less heat than the gas lamps they replaced. Factory owners pushed lighting into corners of buildings that had been permanently dark for decades, allowing them to add entirely new rows of machinery and workstations in spaces that previously had no economic value at all. This meant denser, deeper floor plans, which meant factory buildings could finally be designed without obsessively worrying about where the sun would sit at 3 in the afternoon. This single, almost invisible shift, lighting that no longer depended on windows, quietly broke the very first unbreakable rule that had shaped human shelter for centuries, and it did so years before it ever touched an ordinary family home. The second wave reached far deeper into society, moving from the factory floor into the home itself. And this is precisely where the story stops being about distant mills and starts being about your own bedroom tonight. Once electric light became affordable enough for middle-class households, a gradual shift that took place mostly between 1895 and 1920 across major American and European cities, architects no longer needed to design rooms around where sunlight would fall throughout the day. Houses began growing noticeably deeper, sometimes stretching 12 or even 15 meters from front to back, because a room positioned in the very center of the house no longer required a window to function properly during the day or at night. This is genuinely the moment when sealed, electrically lit interior rooms, the kind we now consider completely ordinary, first became architecturally and economically possible on a wide scale. Bedrooms began drifting away from the locations where natural cross-ventilation was strongest, and instead got placed wherever the floor plan made the most sense on paper, often without any meaningful consideration for airflow at all. Hallways without windows became common. Interior bathrooms with no natural light became standard. None of this would have been physically livable only 30 years earlier, yet within a single generation it became the unquestioned norm for an entire new middle class. If you have made it this far into the story, you are clearly someone who genuinely cares about understanding the small, almost invisible decisions that quietly built the modern world around you, and that curiosity is exactly the reason this channel exists in the first place. Sticking around and subscribing means you will keep receiving these histories delivered directly to you, the stories nobody else bothers to dig into properly, the ones that finally explain why your own daily life feels the way it feels. Whether that is exhaustion, confusion, or simply a nagging sense that something does not add up. There is no pressure here, no countdown clock, no fake sense of urgency, only an honest invitation to stay part of a place where curiosity about the past is treated as something genuinely worth taking seriously, because understanding where your tiredness or your discomfort actually comes from is the first real, practical step toward eventually doing something about it. There is a lot more of that waiting for you if you choose to remain part of this community of people who would rather understand their world than simply accept it. The third wave of impact moved well beyond individual homes and into economics, real estate, and city planning. And this is where the consequences stopped being about single rooms and started reshaping entire urban landscapes across multiple continents. Once electric light and soon after, early mechanical ventilation systems became standard expectations rather than luxuries, urban land itself became dramatically more valuable because buildings no longer needed to remain narrow strips, clinging desperately to natural light sources on every side. Developers in cities like New York, Chicago, and later London began constructing deep, wide apartment blocks designed to maximize every available square meter of increasingly expensive urban land, since interior rooms could now be lit and eventually mechanically ventilated without depending on natural airflow at all. Zoning regulations followed this shift almost immediately. In 1916, New York City passed its first comprehensive zoning resolution, and while that resolution did technically include provisions for light and air, those provisions were calculated based on the explicit assumption that electric lighting would handle whatever natural daylight could no longer reach, a fundamentally different assumption from every building code that had existed before electricity became widely available. Real estate value, urban density, and entire city skylines were now effectively being calculated around the lifespan of a single piece of glowing bamboo filament that had first proven itself inside a quiet laboratory in rural New Jersey decades earlier. This same period saw the slow disappearance of the deep porch, the wide veranda, and the tall operable window that had once defined residential architecture across entire regions, from the American South to colonial structures throughout Asia and Africa. These architectural features existed almost entirely to manage airflow and shade before mechanical alternatives were available, and as electricity made ceiling fans and eventually air conditioning increasingly accessible, builders quietly stopped investing in the structural features that had done the same job for free. Between 1920 and 1950, average ceiling heights in newly constructed American homes dropped from roughly 3 meters to closer to 2.5 meters, partly because electric lighting no longer required the extra volume of air that older homes relied on to stay breathable and cool without mechanical help. Lower ceilings meant cheaper construction, faster building timelines, and smaller heating bills once furnaces became standard. But they also meant smaller volumes of air circulating within each room, setting the stage for problems nobody at the time could have predicted or even imagined. By the middle of the 20th century, air conditioning systems, which only became practical and genuinely affordable for everyday family homes once electrical infrastructure had already been standardized across most cities, completed what the light bulb had originally started decades earlier. Once, a building could be cooled mechanically rather than through shade, airflow and orientation. The final practical reason to design around natural ventilation disappeared almost entirely. Builders sealed windows more tightly than ever before. They deliberately reduced window-to-wall ratios in new construction because glass let in unwanted heat that the cooling system then had to work harder to remove, increasing energy costs. Plaster walls, which had once breathed and naturally regulated humidity for over a century, were gradually replaced with drywall and synthetic insulation, materials engineered to trap moisture and stale air, rather than slowly releasing it the way old lime-based plaster once did. By the 1970s, average American homes were using ceiling materials and synthetic insulation that reduced natural air exchange rates by more than 70% compared to homes built before 1900, according to building science research that was only published decades later. Once researchers finally began asking why indoor air quality had quietly gotten so much worse across an entire generation of newly built housing. The fourth and largest wave of impact is the one playing out silently in your bedroom tonight, and in the bedrooms of roughly 2.8 billion people currently living in cities around the entire world. The World Health Organization has stated that indoor air inside modern sealed homes can be 2 to 5 times more polluted than the outdoor air directly surrounding them, a statistic that would have sounded almost meaningless to anyone living in 1880, because their home was physically incapable of trapping pollutants the way a modern sealed bedroom can. Carbon dioxide quietly builds up overnight inside a closed modern bedroom because the very same walls and windows engineered to keep heated or cooled air trapped inside also trap every breath exhaled by the people sleeping there. Several independent building science studies have shown that bedroom carbon dioxide concentrations can rise high enough by early morning to measurably reduce both sleep quality and next-day cognitive performance, including memory, reaction time, and basic decision-making ability. This is not some hidden conspiracy or a flaw that engineers somehow overlooked by accident. It is the direct, traceable, almost mathematically predictable consequence of slowly removing the exact ventilation rule that shaped every bedroom on Earth for thousands of years, a rule that quietly disappeared the moment artificial light and later artificial climate control made it economically unnecessary for builders to ever follow it again. Here lies the strange, almost uncomfortable irony that makes this entire story difficult to look away from once you truly understand it. Thomas Edison did not set out to change how human beings breathe while they sleep, 6 generations after his own childhood in that small Ohio farmhouse. He was trying to solve one specific, narrow, almost mundane engineering problem: keeping a single filament glowing for more than a few minutes inside a glass bulb. Yet that one solved problem gradually removed the economic and architectural pressure that had forced builders for thousands of years across nearly every culture on Earth to design rooms around airflow, light, and basic human comfort working together as a single unified system. Once light no longer depended on the position of the sun, walls no longer needed to breathe, windows no longer needed to open wide enough to create real cross-ventilation, and entire generations of architecture quietly drifted further and further away from the basic physical needs of the human body, replaced instead by whatever made the most financial sense on a blueprint drawn up by someone who would never personally sleep in that room. The very invention that allowed humanity to push back the darkness is the same invention that indirectly, gradually, and entirely unintentionally helped seal modern bedrooms into the airless, overheated, carbon dioxide heavy boxes that leave so many people across the world waking up exhausted despite spending a full 8 hours lying in bed. Today, the consequences of that small, stubborn filament have grown so large and so widespread that architects and engineers now spend enormous amounts of money trying to recreate, mechanically and electronically, the exact passive airflow and natural humidity regulation that simple plaster walls and tall, draft-prone windows used to provide completely for free. simply by existing in their original unsealed form. Smart ventilation systems, humidity-sensing window vents, and entire formal building certifications such as the Passive House Standard now exist specifically to undo, using sensors, software, and motorized vents, what ordinary houses naturally accomplished long before anyone had ever heard the word electricity spoken aloud. Billions of dollars now flow every single year into research and construction aimed at solving a problem that, structurally speaking, simply did not exist before 1879. The same exact year, a determined young man from a small farmhouse in rural New Jersey finally managed to get a single piece of carbonized bamboo to glow steadily for 1,200 uninterrupted hours inside a sealed glass bulb. Modern sleep researchers have started measuring something they now call sleep architecture, a term that describes the different stages your brain passes through during a full night of rest. And several recent studies have found a direct, measurable correlation between elevated carbon dioxide levels inside a sealed bedroom and a meaningful reduction in the amount of deep, restorative sleep a person experiences across an entire night. Hotels marketed as wellness retreats now advertise rooms with operable windows and natural cross-ventilation as a premium feature, charging significantly more per night for something that, in 1847, was simply the only option available to absolutely everyone, rich or poor, without exception. Entire books have now been written instructing modern homeowners to crack a window before sleeping, to invest in air purifiers, to monitor indoor carbon dioxide using small electronic sensors that sit quietly on a nightstand, essentially trying to manually recreate, room by room, the exact passive ventilation behavior that an ordinary 1847 farmhouse provided automatically, silently, and at absolutely no additional cost to anyone living inside it. And so, the story returns, finally and deliberately, to where it first began, to that same quiet farmhouse in Milan, Ohio, to that same young boy lying in a dark bedroom with no candle lit, inside a room built entirely around rules far older than written memory itself. Rules concerning light, concerning breath, concerning the slow, invisible exchange of air that no machine had ever once needed to manage on its own. That boy grew into a man who, without ever intending to, helped quietly erase the very rules that had once kept him comfortable, rested, and clear-headed through every single night of his own childhood. Tonight, when you finally lie down inside your own sealed, electrically lit, mechanically climate-controlled bedroom, and you find yourself wondering once again why genuine rest feels so much harder to reach than it logically should. Remember that the walls surrounding you right now were never actually designed to breathe the way the walls around that small Ohio farmhouse once did, effortlessly, constantly, and completely free of charge. The smallest spark, lit almost by accident far more than by grand ambition, was enough in the end to quietly and permanently change the very air that the entire modern world now sleeps inside.